Returning to us now here on Waterloo Live is Andrew Field, MBE, retired colonel and author of Grouchy's Waterloo, Ligny and Wavre. Andrew, welcome back. Why was Ligny's position chosen by Blucher, and what did he hope to achieve by offering battle there?
Well, this is quite an interesting question because Clausewitz, in his sort of account of the campaign, he states that Blucher's initial plan when he chose Sombref as a concentration area for the army, an area just to the, if you like, just to the east of the main Brussels road, which Napoleon was probably going to use as his approach towards Brussels. And he states that Blucher's idea was to concentrate his army off to the east, and then as the French marched up the Brussels road to actually attack them in the flank. But of course, at the end of the first day of the campaign, really, the 15th, the Prussians moving back to the concentration at Sombref drew the French after them, and therefore they knew where they were, and therefore they followed them up rather than marching up the Brussels road and exposing their flank to Blucher. So I guess at first it wasn't so much a defensive position as a concentration area. When Blucher realized that considerable French forces were following him, so he set them up in a defensive formation. It's actually a strong position, and therefore that must have been in the back of his mind when he chose it as a concentration area, if that's what he did, because as I say, it's a strong position, some heights above the Ligny stream, and along the stream a number of villages that could become strong points. The heights offered him good dead ground behind a reverse slope position, very a la Wellington, really, because again, contrary to popular belief, most of the Prussian forces were hidden on that reverse slope. Wellington famously said, if he fights there, he'll get damnably mauled, I think were the words he used. But that suggests that the troops were there on the front forward slope and therefore would suffer from the French artillery. But when you study the deployment, what he did is he had a screen forward occupying the villages and the streamline, and most of his forces held and the columns held in the dead ground. And then as the French were perhaps capturing a village or on the verge of capturing a village or making a crossing of the stream, those reserves were then deployed to retake whatever the French had actually seized. So it was quite a clever defense, it was quite an aggressive defense, and it was quite a strong position. The only dilemma he faced is that he wanted to reach out towards Wellington in the west. So if you like, he was drawn a bit to the west where the position wasn't quite so strong. Strong in the center, but then in the east, the road from the Moor really needed protecting because some of his troops had been marching up from there. That's where he'd spent the night before. And he wasn't quite sure where the fourth corps was going to arrive from. So he was drawn into perhaps a much wider position than he really wanted. But I think the bottom line is he had a good, strong position there. And like I say, he was able to carry out quite an aggressive defense.
So how does Napoleon go about trying to break the Prussians at Ligny?
Well, as I think we discussed during Quatre Bras, Napoleon wasn't sure that the Prussians were going to hold at Ligny, and he certainly didn't know that the whole army was due to concentrate there. So Grouchy, commanding the right wing of the French army, was following Blucher, and it was only during the morning of the 16th, that Grouchy started reporting to Napoleon that a bigger and bigger concentration of troops were appearing in front of him. And it was only late in the morning that Napoleon began to believe that Blucher was planning to make a stand, rush forward himself and pull forward the troops that were following on. But because he didn't expect to fight the whole of the the whole of the Prussian army, that concentration was rather slow, and it was only later in the afternoon that he concentrated his whole army. Then his plan really, as we've again already touched on, is that he was going to attack them at the front to try and hold them into position, and then rely on Marshal Ney's troops to march down the road from Quatre Bras into the rear of the Prussian position, and then attacked in the rear and attacked at the front, he hoped to destroy the Prussian army. Napoleon really needed to destroy one of the Allied armies, because if they concentrated together, then the numbers were such that he couldn't expect to defeat them concentrated. So here was an opportunity to not only defeat the Prussians, but to destroy their army, and then he could then turn his attention to Wellington.
As you say, we've touched on elements of this when we sat down to talk about Quatre Bras, but the crucial thing, of course, is that Napoleon isn't able to break the Prussians. Just give us a sense of what goes wrong here that means that doesn't happen.
Well, I think, first of all, the position was a strong one. Secondly, the Prussians actually considerably outnumbered the French. During the battle, the Prussians had 10,000 odd troops more than Napoleon. And so Napoleon was attacking a strong position with an inferior force. And of course, the Prussian army was 3 corps stronger at Ligny. The 4th Corps had not reached the battlefield. And if that had been the case, then Napoleon would certainly have been in a really bad position. But luckily for Napoleon, that corps didn't arrive. But he'd attacked strong position, 10,000 men, I think. And of course, as the day wore on, he developed this idea of Marshal Ney coming in on the Prussian rear. And of course, it didn't happen. So although Napoleon, against the odds, really was able to win a sort of tactical success over the Prussians, he wasn't able to destroy their army, and he ran out of time during the day to really put the coup de grace onto the Prussians, and that allowed them to withdraw in the night, and then, of course, finally meet up with Wellington 2 days later.
Let's stay with exactly that, the kind of Prussian withdrawal, that ability that they have over the night of the 16th, 17th to break away. One of the big problems for Napoleon is that follow-up operation. There are lots of debates about who's at fault with the sort of what appears like a slightly sluggish follow-up. Talk us through the debates behind that and what your feeling is of where the fault does or doesn't lie on this one.
Okay, I think the battle ended quite late at night, between 9 and 10 o'clock, when it was dark. So as far as a pursuit is concerned, that's difficult when you're pursuing an army, a defeated army, in a direction you're not quite sure when they're taking. But the rear guard, the Prussian rear guard, were quite aggressive. They were launching sort of local counterattacks, even in the dark, which held up the French further. But of course, when they started falling back, the question is, who ordered the reconnaissance to identify where the Prussians went? And that is a really difficult one. Everybody says Napoleon was at fault. He should have ordered the follow-up, and he left the battlefield, went to bed about 11 o'clock, and then wasted the following morning. But it shouldn't have taken Napoleon to say, right, we've got to follow the army up. I want you to send troops in this direction, that direction. That is really the chief of staff's responsibility, to coordinate that. All Napoleon really needed to do was say, so make sure we follow them up really closely and find out which direction they're moving in. But that's not to exonerate Napoleon from any blame. Secondly, Soult should have coordinated that. That really was his responsibility. Having been given the guidance by Napoleon, he should have then allocated responsibilities. Grouchy's cavalry had hardly been involved in the Battle of Ligny. There were plenty of relatively fresh cavalry available to scout in every direction. But there's no suggestion that Grouchy actually gave any orders during the night either. Now, he claims that he sent Pajol off, the first cavalry corps off in pursuit, if you like. But actually, Pajol, in his memoirs, said he took the initiative himself, and it was him that sent a division off in pursuit down the Namur road to try and find the Prussians. Exelmans, with the 3rd Cavalry Corps, sorry, the 2nd Cavalry Corps, essentially a dragoon formation, were marched towards Jean Bleu. But we don't seem to know who gave the order for that to happen, and no one claims to have done it. And whether it was Exelmans himself that decided, you're beginning to get this feeling, well, who was in charge? Who was giving direction here? And the answer is no one seems to be. Of course, Namur was in absolutely the wrong direction, which was almost east from the battlefield. And although a lot of Prussian stragglers went down there, and Pajor captured a Prussian battery, which just reinforced the idea that maybe that's where they were going. Jean-Bleu was to the northeast. Now, that was a much more likely direction, because that was falling back on lines of communication, and that's where defeated armies tended to go. But of course, to their eternal credit, the Prussians realized if they fell down their lines of communication, they'd be getting further and further away from Wellington's army, and therefore they would not have the opportunity to concentrate and defeat Napoleon. So they made that very brave decision to give up their lines of communication and move north to stay parallel to Wellington. And it seems that that's a one direction the French didn't consider that they would go. They would go either down an approach that they used for battlefield towards Namur, or to the northeast, down back along their lines of communication. And it really doesn't seem as if any French cavalry was sent north in the direction that the Prussians had actually withdrawn in. And I think the truth is that the responsibility for that lay almost across the chain of command, the French chain of command.
Let's stay with sort of the aftermath of Ligny, and particularly outcomes, and the way in which the outcome at Ligny changes the outlook of the campaign for Napoleon. Is this the closest that he gets to victory over the course of the entire Waterloo campaign?
Yes, it is. It probably is the closest he came, but at the same time, by the end of the day, I think he probably had no chance of winning the campaign at all. If the battle had run the way he wanted it to, then there was a good chance that he would have destroyed the Prussian army and therefore been able to turn his entire force against Wellington. And I don't think many people would doubt that if he'd have been able to do that, then he would have been able to destroy Wellington. Ligny was a very much a tactical victory for Napoleon. He'd beaten a far superior army in strength in a strong defensive position, but he had failed to destroy one of the two allied armies, and that is what his primary aim must have been. The Prussians lived to fight another day, and their considerable losses were made good by joining the Fourth Corps, which, although it hadn't been available during the battle, was able to reinforce the Prussian army and make good the considerable losses that the Prussians had suffered at Ligny. So without getting drawn into the whole Grouchy saga, the scene was set really, if you like, for the decisive Prussian intervention at Waterloo.
Yes, we will get into the Grouchy saga a little later over the course of the live stream. Andrew, you've offered us some fascinating points of discussion. Folks will have a lot of questions to follow that up with. So if you want to read more of Andrew's work, you will find Grouchy's Waterloo, Ligny and Wavre a fascinating read. Colonel Andrew Field, MBE, thank you for joining us on Waterloo Live.
Thanks very much, Simon.